I'm talking about psychological torture and political impunity. With the election of President Barack Obama, the problem of torture has not, as many of us had hoped, simply disappeared, wiped away by some of those new executive orders. Instead, it has now entered into a particularly sordid phase called impunity. Simply put, impunity is the political process of legalizing an illegal act, torture. And whilst physical torture is difficult enough to punish, psychological torture has some distinctive, little understood attributes that makes it both resistant to prosecution or prohibition and conducive, particularly conducive, to the politics of impunity. To explain how and why this troubling past is still very much a part of our political present, let me offer, as an historian, a short history of psychological torture divided into 5 parts: discovery, propagation, perfection, legalization, and now impunity. Part 1, discovery. On April 28, 2004, Americans were stunned when CBS television broadcast those now notorious photographs from Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison showing hooded Iraqis stripped naked while U.S. soldiers stood by smiling. As this scandal grabbed headlines around the globe, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld insisted the abuses were, quote, perpetrated by a small number of U.S. military, whom the conservative New York Times columnist William Safire soon branded as creeps. These photos are not, however, snapshots of a simple brutality or a breakdown in military discipline. Take, for example, that most iconic photo of them all, of a hooded Iraqi standing on a box with electrical wires hanging from his arms with a hood over his head. This shows not the sadism of a few creeps, but instead the 2 key trademarks of CIA psychological torture. The hood is for sensory disorientation. The arms are extended for self-inflicted pain. In short, this photo is a snapshot of a distinctively American form of torture, psychological torture. Viewed historically, the Abu Ghraib scandal is the product of a deeply contradictory U.S. policy toward torture since the start of the Cold War back in the 1950s. Publicly at the United Nations, Washington opposed torture and advocated a universal standard of human rights, manifest in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Simultaneously and secretly, however, the CIA began developing and propagating ingenious new torture techniques in contravention of these same international conventions. From 1950 to 1962, the CIA led a secret research effort to crack the code of human consciousness, a veritable Manhattan Project of the mind with costs that reach at peak $1 billion a year. During this decade, CIA mind control research moved through 2 distinct phases. First, an in-house CIA exploration of exotic techniques such as hypnosis and hallucinogenic drugs. And later, a focus on more mundane behavioral experimentation subcontracted to some of the most brilliant behavioral scientists of their generation. Now, while this agency drug testing led nowhere except to lawsuits, CIA-funded behavioral experiments outsourced to the continent's leading universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, McGill, produced 2 key findings that contributed to the discovery of psychological torture. Discovery number 1, sensory deprivation. In the early 1950s, famed Canadian psychologist Dr. Donald O. Hebb found that he could induce a state akin to psychosis in just 48 hours. Now, what had the doctor done? Drugs? Hypnosis? Electroshock? None of the above. For 2 days, student volunteers at McGill University, where Dr. Hebb was chair of psychology, simply sat in a comfortable air-conditioned cubicle deprived of sensory stimulation by goggles, gloves, and earmuffs. Dr. Hebb himself reported that after just 2 or 3 days of such isolation, quote, the subject's very identity began to disintegrate. Discovery number 2, self-inflicted pain. During the 1950s as well, 2 eminent neurologists at Cornell University Medical Center, working for the CIA, found that the KGB's most devastating torture technique involved not crude physical beatings, but simply forcing the victim to stand immobile for days at a time while the legs swell, the skin erupted in separating lesions, the kidneys shut down, hallucinations began. After a decade of this secret mind control research, in 1963, the CIA codified its findings in a succinct, secret instructional handbook interrogation manual, which became the basis for a new method of psychological torture disseminated worldwide and within the U.S. intelligence community. If genius is the discovery of the obvious, then the CIA's development of this no-touch torture was a counterintuitive breakthrough, the first real revolution in the cruel science of pain in centuries. Through more than 2,000 years of Western judicial torture, the same problem had persisted. The strong defied the pain, while the weak blurted out whatever was necessary to stop it. Everything we have learned about torture in the past 2 millennia can be summarized in an axiom by the 3rd century Roman jurist, a man named Ulpian, and I quote, "For many persons have such strength of body and soul that they heed the pain very little, so that there is no means of obtaining the truth from them, while others are so susceptible to pain that they will tell any lie rather than suffer it." Now, by contrast, the CIA's psychological paradigm fused these new methods, sensory disorientation and self-inflicted pain, whose combination would, in theory, cause victims to feel responsible for their own suffering and thus capitulate more readily, more fully to their inquisitors. Refined through years of practice, the CIA's use of sensory disorientation relies on seemingly banal procedures: heat and cold, light and dark, noise and silence, feast and famine, for a systematic attack on the sensory pathways into the human mind.